Wake up. We're right here. Join us in the dark.
The moment I realized that the relatives I was visiting had actually been dead for 3 weeks, what I felt wasn't fear, it was reality itself. Because the biggest problem wasn't that they were dead. The real problem was that I had been living with them for days. My name is Marcus. I am 30 years old, and before this incident, I was never someone who believed in the supernatural. I believed everything had a logical explanation. But that summer, that belief changed completely because what I experienced was neither a hallucination nor a coincidence. This was something else. And the worst part was, it had started completely normally. My uncle and aunt lived in an old house out of town, and we hadn't seen each other in a long time. One day they called and asked me to stay for a few days, and I accepted because I needed to clear my head. I set off and arrived at their house in the evening. From the outside, the house looked old but well kept. The lights were on. Everything seemed normal, at least until I knocked on the door. The door was already open. When I went to my room at night, I was trying to force myself to accept that everything was normal because those small details I had noticed throughout the day, those vacant stares, those delayed reactions, had accumulated in a corner of my mind. But since I couldn't make sense of any of them individually, it was easier to ignore them all. Sometimes, instead of understanding the truth, a person chooses to dismantle and ignore it, and that is exactly what I was doing. I lay down in bed, closed my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come because that abnormal silence inside the house was filling my ears. This silence wasn't just the absence of sound. It was as if every sound that should have been there had been consciously removed. Because of this, my brain kept saying, "Something is missing." As I tossed and turned in my bed, I heard a very faint sound from downstairs. At first, I wasn't sure because it was so faint I might have imagined it, but a few seconds later, the same sound came again. This time it was clearer, like someone had touched something in the kitchen, a metallic click. It was actually a normal thing, but since nothing in that house felt normal, this sound immediately caught my attention. I opened my eyes and stared into the darkness. I listened for a few seconds. My heart had sped up a little, but I was still trying to find logical explanations for myself. "They must have gotten up for some water," I said, but the feeling inside me didn't accept this explanation. I slowly got out of bed. The floor was cold. This detail might seem unnecessary, but every small thing I noticed at that moment was being etched into my mind because everything was a bit too vivid. I walked toward the door. I hesitated when my hand reached the doorknob because that familiar feeling arose again, the feeling telling me I shouldn't open it. But this time, curiosity weighed heavier. I slowly opened the door and looked into the hallway. The hallway was dark, but this darkness wasn't ordinary. It was as if light couldn't reach there. Even the edges of the walls were hard to distinguish, and this situation distorted my perception of space. I stood there for a few seconds, my eyes trying to adjust to the dark, and just as I was thinking of turning back, I saw a movement. At the end of the hallway, there was a silhouette. I froze because that silhouette was definitely there, yet at the same time, it couldn't be fully distinguished. It was human-shaped but lacked detail. It only gave off a sense of presence, and that sense itself was disturbing enough. I stared without moving for a few seconds, thinking maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me, but that thing moved, very slowly, very controlled. It took a step. And in that moment, I realized it was my aunt. But this realization did not bring me relief, because that walk was not normal. Her steps were taken at equal intervals. They were too regular, as if a human wasn't walking, but rather imitating a walk. This detail magnified the fear inside me because my brain was now stuck between two options. Either what I was seeing was wrong, or what was true was already terrifying. "Aunt," I called out, but my voice came out lower than I expected, as if my throat was being squeezed. That thing stopped. It slowly turned its head toward me, but I couldn't make out its face because the darkness was swallowing it. I only knew it was looking at me. I could feel it, and that feeling was heavy enough. A few seconds of silence passed. Then it spoke, but the voice was not hers. At least, at the first moment I heard it, my brain didn't want to accept it because the words were right. The intonation was largely the same, but something was missing in between. That tiny vibration, that natural fluctuation that gives life to a voice, was gone. It was as if someone had recorded her voice and was now repeating it perfectly but without a soul. "Haven't you slept, Marcus?" she said, and while this sentence was completely normal, the feeling it created in me was not normal at all. I wanted to answer, but I couldn't speak for a few seconds because my mind was trying to process the situation. Finally, I managed to say, "I got up to drink some water," but my voice sounded foreign even to me. In that moment, I realized I couldn't hide my tension either. That thing looked at me for a few more seconds, then tilted its head slightly to the side. This movement was a very small detail, but it was completely unnecessary. A human does this unconsciously, but in her, this movement was like an effort to mimic a behavior. "Good night," she said, and then she turned around. But this time her walk was even more distinct. The steps were the same length, the same speed, with no deviation. It was as if markers had been placed on the floor beforehand and she was simply stepping on them. This sight froze me where I stood because my internal suspicion was no longer just a thought, it was a realization. That thing was not my aunt. I slowly closed the door, leaning my back against it and closing my eyes for a few seconds as I tried to pull my thoughts together. "This isn't real," I said to myself. "You're tired, you're seeing things wrong." But even these sentences didn't carry their own weight because what I felt was very clear. This was not a delusion. I went back to bed, but I was no longer thinking about sleeping. I just wanted to wait for morning because I thought daylight would return everything to normal. This was a childish belief, but I needed it at that moment. Hours didn't pass, they crawled. Every minute felt longer, and during this time, I felt as if my ear was pressed to the door because I wanted to hear even the smallest sound. But nothing happened. That absolute silence returned, and that was even worse. Finally, morning came. When the sunlight entered my room, the pressure on me eased slightly because everything began to look logical again. I told myself, "You exaggerated. It might have felt different at night," and I clung to this thought because I had no other choice. I went downstairs, entered the kitchen, and my aunt was preparing breakfast. Everything looked normal. She turned to me and smiled. This time her smile seemed more natural, but I was now paying attention to the details. "Good morning, Marcus," she said. "Good morning," I replied, but I didn't take my eyes off her because I was looking for something, a mistake, an inconsistency. And a few seconds later I saw it. Her eyes were looking at me, but the focal point was slightly off, as if she were looking not at me but at the empty space slightly beside me. This small difference brought back the unease within me. I sat at the table, my uncle arrived as well. It was like any normal morning, the conversation was mundane. "Did you sleep well?" they asked. "Yes," I said, but it was a lie. In reality, nothing was normal. We ate, but something caught my attention. Both of them were barely eating. They were just touching their forks to their plates, making small movements, but they weren't really eating. This detail was so subtle I might not have noticed it, but now I was watching everything. After a while, I couldn't take it anymore and said, "I saw you in the hallway last night," while looking at my aunt. This sentence instantly made the atmosphere heavy because both of them stopped at the same time. Neither spoke for a few seconds. Then my aunt looked at me and smiled. "I was up, yes," she said. This answer was not enough. "You said something to me," I said. "I don't remember," she said. This time my uncle spoke. "She likes to wander at night sometimes," he said, but his voice was too fast, as if he were giving a prepared answer. This detail fully triggered the alarm inside me because this was no longer a chain of coincidences. This showed that something was being maintained. And in that moment, I realized that I was not alone in this house, but the things I was living with were not human. The moment the realization that the things I was living with were not human settled clearly in my mind, there was no turning back. Because once you notice something, you cannot unnotice it. You can only try to ignore it, and in that moment I couldn't even do that. As I sat at the breakfast table, I tried to maintain a normal expression on my face, but the tension inside me had reached an uncontrollable level. I watched their every move, analyzed every tiny detail, because now even a single mistake could fully reveal the truth. My aunt was looking at her plate, but she wasn't truly looking. Her eyes were there, but her mind was as if it were somewhere else. My uncle's hand rested motionless on the table, but every few seconds he repeated the same small movement. These repetitions weren't random. It was as if they had entered a loop, and this deepened the fear inside me because this was no longer behavior. It was like a program. I felt I had to say something because the silence was becoming unbearable. "I'm going to go out for a bit today," I said. This sentence was actually a test. I wanted to see their reaction because a normal person would respond to such a sentence in an ordinary way. But they did not react for a few seconds, as if it took time for them to process the sentence. Then my aunt raised her head. "You can go," she said. This answer was too fast, too smooth, and most importantly, too emotionless. My uncle nodded as well, but his eyes weren't on me. They were looking at that empty space beside me again. This recurring detail was now too prominent to ignore because it wasn't a habit, it was a deficiency. It was as if they didn't really know how to look, they were just imitating it. I got up from the table and walked toward the door, but I had a strange feeling, as if leaving this house wouldn't be as easy as I thought. I reached the door, grabbed the handle, and turned it. The door wouldn't open. At first, I thought it was locked, but it wasn't. The handle turned, the mechanism worked, but the door wouldn't budge. This was physically impossible. I tried a few more times, pulled harder, but the result didn't change. It was as if the door had turned into a wall. No sound of footsteps came from behind me. This was even worse, because they were still at the table, and they were watching me. I slowly turned around. Both were looking at me, but in the same way, their eyes not quite focusing on me. This sight made my stomach turn because they were no longer trying to hide, or perhaps they didn't need to. "The door won't open," I said. My voice was sharper this time. My aunt tilted her head slightly, looked at me for a few seconds, then spoke very calmly. "There is no need for it to open." This sentence changed everything. Because this wasn't an explanation, this was a rule. My heart raced, my mind began searching for a way out, but at the same time I noticed something else. The house didn't look the same as before. The walls were the same, but the distances seemed to have changed. The living room was a bit longer, the kitchen a bit narrower. This difference was small enough to miss at first glance, but it could be felt. This house was not fixed. I took a step back, then another. There was only one thought in my mind: I had to get out of this place. But the exit was no longer just a door. The rules of this place were different, and I didn't know those rules. That was my biggest disadvantage. My aunt slowly stood up. My uncle moved at the same time. This synchronization was not natural. They both took a step toward me. And in that moment I understood I hadn't come to this house as a guest. I had been brought here to stay. I had been brought here to stay. The moment this thought settled in my mind, panic took full control, but strangely, my body didn't freeze. On the contrary, I became more alert because survival instinct had taken over from fear. That synchronized step they took toward me had clarified everything. These things weren't here to scare me. They were here to keep me. I backed away, trying to keep my distance. Their movements were slow, but this slowness wasn't a weakness. It was more like conscious control. It was as if they didn't need to hurry because they knew I couldn't escape. This thought alone was enough to tighten my chest, but I forced myself. "Stay calm," I said internally. "Wait for them to make a mistake." Because so far, that was my only advantage. They weren't perfect. They were just very good at imitating. "I want to get some fresh air," I said. This sentence was completely unnecessary since I couldn't leave anyway, but I wanted to gauge their reaction. My aunt tilted her head again in that strange way. This movement no longer felt natural to me. Every time I saw it, something inside me tightened. "The air is here," she said. This answer was illogical, but for her, it made sense. My uncle didn't speak. He just looked at me, or rather, pretended to look. This silence was more oppressive because words at least try to hide things, but silence leaves the truth as it is. I realized I had to try something. I couldn't leave through the door, but I could move within the house. So I slowly slid to the side, heading toward the hallway without taking my eyes off them. They approached me at the same speed, but the distance between us didn't change. This showed that this wasn't just a physical pursuit. This was within a controlled space. I reached the hallway, and in that moment something changed. The house became quieter, but this silence was different, more intense, more oppressive, as if even the walls were breathing. This feeling settled in my stomach because I had experienced this hallway before. This was exactly what I had seen at night. I slowly turned around. They hadn't entered the hallway. They stood at the entrance of the living room, and they were watching me. But this time, they weren't coming inside. This detail sparked something in my brain because it meant this wasn't their territory, or there was something else here. This thought both terrified me and in a strange way emboldened me. For the first time, I saw a boundary, and boundaries meant rules, and rules meant they could be used. I slowly moved further into the hallway. Each step felt heavier because the air had changed. It was colder, denser, as if I were passing through something invisible. After a few steps, I stopped because a familiar feeling arose. The feeling that someone was watching me. But this time, not from behind, from the front. I looked to the end of the hallway. It was dark. But within that darkness, there was something. It wasn't moving, but it was there. I tried to squint, wanting to pick out details, but no matter how hard I focused, I only saw a shape. It was human-like, but not quite. It was tall, its shoulders were narrow, and the most disturbing part was its posture. It was as if it was slightly different from how it should be. This small difference was enough to trigger the fear inside me. I took a step. That thing didn't move. I took another step. And in that moment, a voice came from behind me, "Don't go there." Froze because this voice wasn't Clara's, it wasn't my aunt's. This voice was different. It was deeper, more muffled, and most importantly, it was a voice I was hearing for the first time, yet it felt strangely familiar. This feeling confused my brain because feeling that something you don't know is familiar is one of the most unsettling things. I slowly turned around. There was no one. The living room was empty. They were gone. This doubled the tension inside me because now I wasn't alone, but I wasn't with them either. This feeling of being stuck in between was the most dangerous one because you don't know who you belong to. I looked forward again. That thing was still there. But this time it was closer. I hadn't moved, but it had come. My heart raced, my breath shortened, but this time I didn't run. Because another feeling had formed inside me. This thing was different from them. That was clear, and perhaps this difference was my only chance. "What are you?" I asked. My voice trembled, but I was surprised it even came out because at this point even speaking was difficult. That thing didn't answer, but it tilted its head slightly to the side, the same movement, but this time more natural. And in that moment, I was truly afraid. Because this was not an imitation, this was the original, this was the original. The moment I felt this, all the balance within me broke. Because everything I had seen until now was like a copy of something incomplete, flawed, artificial. But this thing was not like that. This entity felt like it belonged exactly where it was. Its movements were slower, yet more fluid. Even this difference made me feel how real it was. And this reality was more terrifying. I didn't step back. Perhaps it was a mistake, but running didn't feel right at that moment because everything I had run from had led me to something else. So I stood and watched. It was watching me too, or at least that's how it felt because I still couldn't make out its face. The darkness was hiding it, but this hiding wasn't a deficiency. It was more like a concealment, as if it had a face, but I wasn't supposed to see it. There was a period of silence, then it spoke. But this time, the voice didn't come directly to my ears. It echoed inside my mind. "They keep you." This sentence was so clear, it was as if I hadn't thought it, but it had been given to me. I reflexively looked around, but there was no source for the voice because the voice hadn't come from the outside. This took the fear inside me to another level because now I wasn't even sure of the things I thought, let alone the things I saw. "Who are you?" I asked, this time more clearly. But even while waiting for the answer, there was a tension within me because the answer it would give could change everything. A few seconds of silence passed. "Then this place," it said. This answer wasn't an answer, but it was enough. Because in that moment I understood that this thing was not an entity, it was the place itself, or at least a part of it. This realization completely changed the fear inside me because I was no longer facing a thing, I was facing a system. "What are they?" I asked. This question was more important because the real danger was them. "Imitation," it said, a single word, but it explained everything. I slowly nodded because this was already something I had felt, but confirming it was heavier. "Why are they keeping me?" I asked, because the answer to this was my way out. A few seconds of silence passed, then substitution. Those two words broke something inside me. "What does that mean?" I asked, but I already felt the answer. I just didn't want to hear it. That thing came a little closer this time. The distance between us decreased, and in that moment I saw its face for the first time. But it wasn't a face, it was my face. My breath hitched. I stepped back, but this time my body didn't obey me because my brain was trying to process this image. It was impossible, yet undeniable. That thing looked like me, but at the same time, it looked more correct than me. This feeling was indescribable because something being more you than you are breaks a person's mind. They take your place, it said. And in that moment, everything clicked. The moment everything clicked, the fear inside me turned into a cold reality because I finally knew what I was up against. This house wasn't just a strange place. It was a trap, and the purpose of this trap was simple: to keep me here and to send something in my place. The moment this thought settled in my mind, every past detail gained meaning. The door not opening, their synchronized movements, the emotionless speech. It was all a preparation. "What will go in my place?" I asked. Though I could guess the answer, the thing looked at me and it smiled. But that smile was my smile. "Ready," it said. This word broke the last bit of resistance inside me because this wasn't just a plan. This was something that had already begun. "For how long?" I asked, because the answer to this was the most frightening part. A few seconds of silence passed, then 3 weeks. This answer shattered everything, because it meant long before I thought I had arrived here, I had already arrived. My mind didn't want to accept it, but my body reacted. I backed away, my breathing quickened, my heart felt like it would tear through my chest because this was no longer a possibility. It was something that had happened. "I went out," I said. It was an objection, but also a plea. The thing tilted its head slightly. "You remember," it said. And in that moment, the images came, piece by piece, broken and jagged. The moment I first opened the door, the moment I stepped inside, the moment they looked at me. And one more moment, the moment I opened the door again. But this time, the moment I didn't go back out, my knees gave way. Because in that moment I understood I was still here. I was still here, and this realization destroyed the last bit of hope inside me. Because every moment I thought I had escaped was actually just one of the moments I continued to remain inside this place. This house wasn't just a location, it was a loop, and I was inside that loop. My breathing became irregular, my head began to spin because my mind didn't want to accept this truth, but the images wouldn't stop. Everything was repeating. The same scenes, the same movements, the same sentences, like a recording. "Is there no way out?" I asked, because now that was the only question. The thing looked at me. It didn't answer for a long time. "Then there is," it said. My heart stopped for a second. "How?" I asked. This time it answered faster: substitution. The answer was the same. But this time the meaning was different. "So," I said, but I couldn't finish the sentence because I understood the answer. The only way out of here was for someone else to stay here. This thought started a war inside me because this wasn't just an escape, it was a choice, and that choice is what defines a person. For a few seconds I said nothing because making this decision was impossible. But at the same time there was no other option. The thing approached me and whispered, "You already did." This sentence ended everything. Because in that moment I realized I had already made the decision, and that decision had saved me. If you are listening to this, I am likely already outside. I seem to have returned to my normal life. I talk, I smile, I interact with people. But sometimes at night, when I look in the mirror, I don't recognize myself. Because something is missing in my eyes, something is wrong. And this feeling consumes me a little more every day because I know that house is still there. And the scariest part is this: am I really the person who got out, or the thing that was sent in my place?